interest in children and young people developed in the first project that I worked on after my PhD, which was looking at the well-being of people across the life course. So not just adults, as development has tended historically to focus on, but young people, older people. And I found the subject particularly of children and young people very, very engaging on a number of different levels. If you look at it from a sort of human capital perspective, then clearly it's important to invest in the next generation, and that's an argument that's being made. But in a sense, that's quite a soulless argument, because it's much more interesting to engage with young people, find out about their lives and what matters to them. So then you move perhaps towards a more sort of child rights argument, which says that children have particular rights, or maybe we don't use the concept rights, but there are particular things that they can achieve in their societies, and how can interventions better support them to do that? And then another perspective one might take would be a more humanitarian one, which says, well, children are very vulnerable and therefore they need protection. But I feel perhaps less resonance with that, because I think that we need to acknowledge that children have a lot of agency. And of course, I'm using the term children, but in fact, there's a great deal of diversity within groups of children. Then at what point do you actually become an adult? And this is something that's hotly debated. And usually people would say, oh, well, we're talking about a period from sort of age 0 through to 24. That would be one perspective. It would be quite unusual in Ethiopia, for example, to have a child as old as 7 or 8 who wasn't taking on some household, doing some household chores, maybe herding cattle. And one of the problems with young boys starting school is that they're often herding cattle from a very early age, and so their start into school is much delayed, and then they find it quite difficult to catch up. They feel demotivated being the oldest boy in a class of quite young children. Although most countries have clear ages under which people can't be legally married, the customary age for marriage is often a lot lower than that, and it's usually that's observed. And so if you look, for example, at demographic and health service data, you can find out when adults today got married, and you can probably get quite an honest answer to that. And you can see that actually of the sort of 18 to 22-year-olds now, a surprising number of them were married before they were aged 15, even though that was obviously illegal. But obviously if you go into a village and you talk to some 13 and 14-year-olds or their parents, and you say how many of them are married, then no one's going to tell you, because clearly it's illegal and they could get into trouble. So it's often only in retrospect that you get a sense of how big a problem this is. What I'm quite excited about at the moment is that DFID has just funded the Global Girls Research Initiative, which is a longitudinal study looking at adolescent girls over between 7 and 9 years. And it's unique in a number of aspects. And one of them is that it's very much focused around the interventions that make girls' lives better. And those are a very valuable resource, because we can see how boys' and girls' lives change over time. And we can also see this in the context of their communities through qualitative research. But it's because of the way in which the samples were constructed, it's rare that you have an intervention taking place in that particular area that you can fortuitously use your data to say something about. Whereas this is actually, when we sample, we're actually going to focus it around particular common interventions. So in addressing questions like what works tackling early marriage, what works economically empowering girls, we'll actually have more solid evidence on that, as well as broader evidence about the kinds of challenges that girls face in different countries as they grow older. So these types of methodologies enable us to evaluate quite complex projects which might be multi-component and often have a non-linear trajectory where things don't, you don't have the intervention and then things get better and better and better. There's often a backlash or a sort of a very slow progress in terms of the project, and where you evaluate the project is very important then in deciding whether it's been successful or not. But I think what we're also seeing is a greater attention to early years care and development, and that's partly, as I was saying, the human capital narrative that you invest early and you reap greater rewards, and that's been demonstrated by economists such as James Heckman. But it's as well as being a sort of a very efficient way to invest, it's also a realisation that at the moment we have the largest population of children and young people that the world has ever seen. They're concentrated in developing countries, they're predominantly poor, and there are a couple of different perspectives, and one of them is the very cautious youth bold perspective, which says, oh well, we've got all these children and young people, many of whom aren't even in education because there aren't the school places for them, and this is actually a big problem and it's going to lead to political violence, and they're all being recruited by Boko Haram, and oh, it's all so terrible. But another way to look at it, of course, is to say, well, this is a demographic dividend. We've got young people, the greatest number of young people the world has ever seen, and how can we educate and support them to make changes in their countries that will be very productive in the future? So the next 10 years feels like a very important opportunity for people working within development to invest money in children and young people, to try and address some of the barriers that they face, which are often very complex and very social, to create environments in which they can genuinely flourish. And I think in doing this, one of the problems that we have is that the evidence base is not particularly good. When you read on NGO websites statistics for child slavery, child trafficking, child marriage, female genital mutilation, even school attendance, they're very rarely reliable and they're rarely consistent. So I think there needs to be a greater investment into collecting more realistic statistics, but I think also thinking about what kind of indicators we want to measure. Because at the time of the Millennium Development Goals, a great emphasis was placed on universal primary education. So it appeared that lots of children were got into schools, but whether those children actually then continued in school, whether they progressed to the next grade, whether what they were learning was actually of any value whatsoever, this wasn't really measured in quite the same way. There was a great emphasis on primary education, but a much lesser emphasis on secondary education. And actually, there's not so much that you can do with primary education on its own. I mean, it does show some benefits in the long term in terms of better health outcomes for the children of someone who's received primary education. But in the labour market, in many societies, it's virtually valueless. Addressing what happens further down the line, the quality of it, when you get the children in the schools, that's only the first step. What do they actually learn when they're there, and what do they experience? Because many schools can be quite hostile and unpleasant environments. There's often quite a high degree of violence directed towards children, and also sexual violence directed towards girls from pupils and even from teachers. Or there's a kind of lack of sensitivity to their needs to the extent that they don't have separate toilet facilities. And these types of things make it harder for girls to go to school. It makes it harder for parents to justify sending girls to school. And then at the end of it, if they need to travel long distances in order to work, then it's not necessarily worthwhile. So paying greater attention to what happens further down the line in terms of labour markets, and particularly in terms of jobs that exist at a much more local level is clearly quite important. So when you talk to government officials, emphasising that if you put lots of money in education, particularly in early years education, but also in secondary and higher education, then you will start to reap these benefits. You'll be able to attract different types of firms to the countries, you stimulate your own manufacturing, and take on the roles that countries that you might see as being just a little bit ahead of you in terms of development, like Taiwan or South Korea. You can also rival those if you're prepared to invest in your young people. So that's one argument you could make, but obviously there are different arguments that can be made according to the priorities of different societies. In Bangladesh, they've been tremendously successful in reducing the birth rate by making an argument around education, which says, have 2 children, but bring them up right. The way that you nurture your children is tremendously important. As a family, you'll be judged on that. The happiest families are the smallest families, and messages that are promoted through a number of different means, which in a sense create quite a different vision of childhood, a vision of childhood that's maybe perhaps has more in common with how children are treated in the UK. I mean, this isn't universal. I'm probably talking here primarily about an urban experience, an experience that's particularly evident in Dhaka, the capital city, and maybe less so in rural areas. But it does emphasise the importance in talking to governments, in talking to community leaders, in talking to parents, in talking to children themselves. You're finding a way to engage that's meaningful and what matters to them. Children who want to go to school have to have uniforms, they have to have school materials, and often that's the barrier to parents sending them to school. If a child can work over the summer in a vegetable farm and earn the money, the income that they then control, and they can use it to buy their school supplies, and then they can go to school, they're very happy with that. My interest would be in making it more possible for children to work without sacrificing their education. So looking at ways in which schools can be more flexible. Shift schooling, although it's sometimes derided in some countries, can be quite beneficial if it means that children can do household chores in the morning and then go to school in the afternoon. But it does often make for a very long day for children if they have chores, then schooling, then work, and a number of different caring responsibilities as well. So I think thinking as well as about what children can be in the future, the quality of life that they're experiencing in the here and now is very important. I suppose I would say 2 important things to bear in mind are the intra-household distribution of resources and responsibilities, and it's something that's often raised in relation to gender, but also the way in which children's different identities come together. A child is never just a child. They come from a particular household. They have a particular religious affiliation, a particular ethnicity, and they might face some physical disabilities. I mean, all these intersect to create the particular thing that they're experiencing. So while it's possible to say that in general children have a worse deal than adults, it's not that's not always true, and it's not true for all children. So it's actually quite helpful to sort of go beneath the surface. And when you have categories such as AIDS orphans, on one hand, that's it's not helpful, because AIDS orphans may experience very similar things to children who are not AIDS orphans, who've perhaps lost parents for other reasons, or haven't lost parents at all but are nonetheless in extreme poverty. They may all have a lot in common. And then within this category of AIDS orphans, which is quite good for fundraising, you might find, as has been found, that children who've lost a mother are actually much worse off than children who's lost a father, and that among children who's lost a mother, girls tend to have worse experiences in terms of schooling than boys. So it's clearly very important to go beneath the surface, beneath these categories, and to look at the ways in which gender, age and other statuses intersect to produce a particular experience for an individual child. We've talked about the importance of not separating out children and young people, and I think that we can argue that a world that is more equal, a world where there's a solid social protection floor, is beneficial for everyone. And when we look at problems that seem to just affect children, like the kinds of issues around abuse that are raised in relation to child protection, we can actually see some of the same causes manifest around poverty and the stresses placed on families, expressing themselves through intimate partner violence as well. So it's not, when a child is abused, it's not necessarily a child protection issue that needs to be dealt with by specialists. It could be indicative of a kind of a wider pathology that's being experienced by the household, relating to scarcity of food, lack of employment opportunities, and the way pressures bear down on the men in the households, causing them to drink heavily, perhaps to beat their partners, perhaps to beat their children as well. So it's not actually a separate issue, but it's something that needs to be tackled at the household or community level. And it's important perhaps to look yes, at the particular things that children experience, but also at the things that they have in common with other groups that are less powerful within society.